out here to talk about racial disparities in school suspensions. As you may know, this is the third report on this issue that we have issued in 3 years, taking a look at suspension rates in Rhode Island schools generally, and specifically at the suspension rates of Black and Hispanic youth, minority youth overall. We are well aware in Rhode Island and in the country as a whole of the deleterious impact of school suspensions. Suspensions are correlated with higher dropout rates. They are correlated with lower income, long-term lower income status. They are disturbingly most correlated with an increased likelihood of becoming involved in the juvenile justice system and then subsequently in the adult justice system. And so we know that it's suspensions themselves that are the problem, and that a single suspension can impact a child for the rest of their lives. As the rest of the country starts to talk very seriously about limiting the use of out-of-school suspensions, Rhode Island schools are continuing to suspend students at very high rates. And those rates are disproportionately high for children of color, particularly Black and Hispanic youth. In fact, this year is, for Hispanic and Native American youth, the highest suspension rates in the last 10 years. For Black students, it is only marginally better than last year. Native American students last year were suspended at rates 2.67 times higher than what we would expect to see given their representation in the population. And Hispanic youth were suspended 1.59 times higher. Black students were suspended 2.18 times what we would expect to see given their representation in the population. At the same time, white students have experienced their lowest suspension rate on record, which means that the racial disparities in school suspensions are only growing. In 10 years, this is the worst that we have seen. The vast majority of these suspensions, 60%, are for low-risk behavioral infractions. And in fact, 52% of all suspensions are for disorderly conduct and insubordination or disrespect. These are very broadly worded terms that basically capture every stupid decision that a kid can make in school. Every time they talk back, every time they don't go somewhere fast enough, every time they don't do something that fits into another category. And that's more than half of all suspensions. To put this in perspective, last year it was about 1/3 of all suspensions were for these two offenses, so the problem is only increasing. When we look at those two offenses of disorderly conduct and insubordination, we see an even more disturbing picture than if we look at suspensions overall. Black youth were suspended for these offenses 2.27 times as often as expected, and white students just half as often as we would expect. These suspension disparities affect the youngest children. We have more than 100, around 150 elementary school first graders who are suspended every year. And Black students are suspended at rates nearly 3 times what we would expect to see given their representation in the population. Now, to remember, when we talk about a suspension, a single suspension can impact a student for their entire life. With Black students more likely to be suspended by the time they turn 10, this is very, very concerning for us. More than 1/3 of suspensions for elementary school students are again for disorderly conduct or insubordination and disrespect. Once a student reaches high school, the disparities even out a little bit, but they're still very, very disturbing. Black students are suspended in high school 1.83 times as often as expected, and white students are suspended around 3/4 of what we would expect to see. We wanted to take a particular look this year at the impact on girls of color, particularly Black girls. We all know, just from conventional wisdom, boys end up suspended more often than girls. But for Black students, around 7% of the entire Black female student population is suspended at least once, or was suspended at least once last year. And in fact, the racial disparity between Black girls and white girls is greater than that of the racial disparity between Black boys and white boys. A Black girl is nearly 4 times as likely as a white girl to be suspended from school. And when you're talking specifically about disorderly conduct or insubordination, which is 55% of suspensions for girls, Black girls are suspended 4.68 times as likely as what we would expect to see for those two offenses alone. This is something that affects all of our children. Suspensions are used disproportionately high against all of our students, but the students of color are particularly impacted. They've been particularly impacted for a decade. We are asking for passage of legislation, which is contained within your press packet, which would address these suspension issues for all students, not solely students of color. The legislation requires that students are not suspended except in instances where they pose a serious risk, physical risk, or serious disruption to the students around them and cannot be controlled by other means. And it requires school districts to take a look at their own data annually to determine if there's any racial disparities and how best to fix them. We are hopeful that passage of this legislation would bring a tremendous impact on these students, keep them in school, keep them out of the juvenile justice system, keep them out of the adult justice system, and benefit all of us.